The first time the old woman moved, no one in the hospital room noticed. She was, after all, just another patient, frail, silent, lost in the fog of age and injury. The nurses had brought her in 2 hours prior, a Jane Doe from a car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. No identification, no wallet, just a worn-out leather jacket that smelled of salt and sage. Her silver hair was matted with blood, and her face, a roadmap of deep wrinkles, was slack with unconsciousness. The room was filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the quiet shuffling of staff. Then the SEAL arrived. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne filled the doorway, his presence a sudden displacement of air and light. Fresh from a deployment and on mandatory leave, he was filling in for a friend by visiting a young patient down the hall. He was a weapons system disguised as a man, all coiled muscle and controlled energy, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. He wore his dark hair high and tight, and a faint scar bisected his left eyebrow, a memento from a frag grenade in Ramadi. The nurses instinctively straightened their postures when he passed. He was a quiet, dangerous force of nature. He was just passing room 312 when a low, guttural sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't a groan of pain. It was a sound of absolute, primal refusal. It came from the old woman. Her eyes were still closed, but her head thrashed on the pillow, her gnarled hands clenching the thin hospital sheet with a strength that seemed impossible for her frame. A young, flustered intern was trying to adjust the 4 in her arm. His touch gentle but clumsy. "It's okay, ma'am. We're just trying to help you," the intern mumbled. His voice reedy with inexperience. The woman's response was a single, guttural word, thick with an accent he couldn't place. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language Marcus had heard in the polished halls of the Naval Academy. It was the raw, animal language of survival. The intern, startled, pulled his hand back. "She's delirious. I'll get a sedative." But Marcus was already moving into the room. He didn't walk like a visitor. He moved like a predator entering a kill zone, his footsteps silent on the linoleum. He ignored the intern and the chirping monitors. His focus was solely on the woman. Her thrashing was not random. It was patterned, economical. Each movement was designed to protect her core, to shield her face, to free a hand. It was a combat role. It was the muscle memory of someone who had fought for their life, not in a ring, but in the dirt. He crouched beside the bed, bringing himself to her eye level, even though her eyes were shut. He didn't speak. He just watched. Her hand shot out, not to grab him, but to check the space. Her fingers brushed his shoulder, and she froze. A sudden stillness fell over her, more terrifying than the thrashing. Her eyes snapped open. They weren't the milky, confused eyes of a geriatric patient. They were the eyes of a cornered valve, clear, sharp, and blazing with a terrifying intelligence. They locked onto Marcus. In that single, silent exchange, a complete assessment was made. She saw the high and tight haircut, the erect posture, the way his body blocked the light from the doorway, the subtle calluses on his knuckles. He saw the fine, white scars on her forearms. The way the skin around her left eye was a shade lighter than the rest, as if it had been reconstructed, and the peculiar way her thumbs were slightly bent. A common injury in those who had spent decades breaking falls and necks. The room, which had been a hive of medical anxiety, fell utterly still. The beeping of the monitors seemed to grow louder in the vacuum of sound. The intern stood frozen, his hand still reaching for the sedative. A nurse at the door held her breath. It was a standoff between two warriors, decades apart in age, but speaking the same silent, deadly language. Then, the woman spoke. Her voice was a dry rasp, like whined over gravel, but the words were perfectly clear English, clipped and precise. "You're in my sector, son." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. She was establishing her territory, even from a hospital bed. Marcus didn't flinch. He gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. "Yes, ma'am. I am." He made no move to touch her. He simply remained in her line of sight, a non-threatening, but alert presence. Her eyes didn't leave his. They were searching, cataloging. Finally, she spoke again, the rasp softening slightly. "Navy." It wasn't a question. He nodded again. "Yes, ma'am." A flicker of something not quite respect, but recognition passed through her eyes. "Get this boy out of here," she said, jerking her chin towards the terrified intern. "He's going to get himself killed messing with things he doesn't understand." Marcus looked at the intern. "Give us the room," he said, his voice low but carrying the absolute weight of command. The intern and the nurse didn't hesitate. They fled, leaving the SEAL alone with the silent, wounded woman. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The woman's breathing slowed, the wild energy in her eyes receding, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. The adrenaline that had flooded her system was crashing, leaving her looking every one of her 80-plus years. Her hand, still resting on the sheet, was a map of hard labor, prominent veins, knotted knuckles, a small, faded tattoo of a swallow on the web of skin between her thumb and forefinger. Marcus's eyes snagged on it. A swallow often meant a long journey or a return home. But on her, it seemed like a brand. Marcus pulled up the single plastic chair in the room, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He sat, his posture still alert, his forearms resting on his thighs. He didn't bombard her with questions. He just waited. In his world, patience was the sharpest tool in the kit. You waited for the target to reveal itself. You waited for the informant to speak. You waited for the enemy to make a mistake. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor and the distant, muffled sounds of the hospital. The woman's gaze drifted from him to the ceiling, her eyes unfocused, seeing something else entirely. Minutes passed. Marcus remained a statue. Finally, her voice, softer now, a whisper of its former self, broke the quiet. "The damn car just came out of nowhere. T-boned me." Stupid kid on his phone. She didn't look at him. "I've survived things that would make that boy's blood run cold, and I get taken out by a Honda Civic." A ghost of a smile touched Marcus's lips. He understood the bitter irony. It was the small, mundane things that got you. Not the ambush, not the firefight, but a faulty parachute, a bad case of food poisoning, a car running a red light. "Wasn't your time," Marcus said. It was a simple statement, a fact. She turned her head slowly on the pillow to look at him. The fire was gone, replaced by a deep, soulful sadness. "How would you know, son?" "Because you're still here," he replied, his voice even. "And because when I came in, you didn't scream or cry for help. You assessed the threat. You secured your perimeter. You identified a friendly from a hostile." He gestured subtly at her hands, now limp at her sides. "The body doesn't forget. Neither does the mind." She stared at him for a long, searching moment. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't treating her like a confused old woman. He was treating her like an equal, like a fellow operator. "You're a SEAL," she stated. It wasn't a guess this time. It was a confirmation. "Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I knew some of your kind, a long time ago." In a different world, her eyes drifted to the window, where the last light of the California sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A world without sunlight. The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was heavy with unspoken histories, with ghosts that had just been invited into the sterile space. Marcus knew better than to push. He had thrown the door open a crack. It was up to her whether she walked through it. He leaned back in the chair, making himself comfortable. He had all night. And he had a feeling that the story waiting to be told was more important than any after-action report he had ever filed. The old woman on the bed was a locked container, and he had just been handed the keys. The first key was patience. The second was respect. He settled in to wait for the third. The silence in the room was a living thing, breathing with its own rhythm. Marcus watched as the woman's eyes tracked the dying light on the ceiling, her mind clearly miles and decades away. He saw the subtle twitch in her jaw, the way her fingers would occasionally curl into a loose fist before relaxing. She was wrestling with something, a decision to speak or remain silent. He gave her the space, his own mind drifting to the mountains of Afghanistan. The humid heat of the Philippines, the faces of men he'd lost, and the ones he'd sent into the dark. Finally, she spoke, her voice a low monotone, as if she were reading a report from a very old, very painful file. "My name is Elara Kovac. I was born in a place that doesn't exist on most maps anymore, in a year that feels like a different century." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "The Soviets came when I was 12. I remember the sound of the helicopters first. A thumping that got into your bones and stayed there. Then the bombs." Marcus didn't react. He'd heard stories like this before, from refugees, from interpreters, from the eyes of children in dusty villages. But this was different. This woman wasn't telling him a story of victimhood. She was telling him a prelude.